Marhaba, everyone. Sabah al khair. Hello and good morning. My name is Shereen Sharaan. I am a researcher at the University of Edinburgh. I don't know if some of you were here yesterday. You must have caught the talk from Bilingualism, who also talked about this theme. So, before talking to you about this specific theme, I just want to give you a bit of a background story, because I'm always really interested in how people came to be interested about the things that they're passionate about. So have a bit of a personal story to share with you on autism and bilingualism. So I grew up with two brothers. My younger brother was, born pretty typically developing, and had this larger-than-life personality. And suddenly, at the age of 2.5, he had a severe regression in his speech and social skills. So he lost 400 words of vocabulary in something like 13 days. It became one word: water. So you're water, I'm water, he's water. In terms of social skills, obviously he went from someone who was just incredibly social, just wanted to would go up to random people, just want to socialize with them, to someone who literally became living in his own kind of world. Obviously, my parents were shocked. They were devastated. It was like a sudden death. You couldn't really recognize that child anymore. Fast forward, they traveled to the States. They went to Boston League School, who was a pioneer at the time in terms of the autism education. And they put an intervention plan for Arm. So he received his formal diagnosis in 1992. He was diagnosed with the autism spectrum condition. They came back to the Emirates. My mother converted his bedroom into a little autism center. So she took out the furniture, the bed, the couch, the carpet, and she just started to apply all the programs that she had learned and acquired from her training in the States. I think she worked something like 17 hours per day with him, one-on-one. Door was shut, and they were just, working on things like ABA, speech therapy, so on, so on. Fast forward a few years later, in the UAE, which is where I was born and raised. So I'm from Egypt, but born and raised in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi specifically. She had a meeting in 2001 with the Ministry of Education. I still don't know how she got that meeting, but she had a meeting with them and she pitched his case. So she showed them videos of my younger brother, him doing math, English, science, basically taking on all the subjects that children at school do as well. And in 2001, they decided to experiment. So prior to 2001, there are no known cases of children with the autism being included in mainstream schools. In 2001, Amru became the first autistic child in the country to receive inclusion in a mainstream school. And several years later, he became the first autistic in the country to receive a high school diploma. In 2013, he became the first autistic in the country to receive inclusion in the workforce. So my mother founded the Autism Center in the capital in Abu Dhabi. So he works there today, full-time. Sometimes I borrow money from him when I need to. His big sister, yeah. So that's just to tell you a bit about my journey and my family's journey with the autism. With bilingualism, I'm bilingual myself. I speak English and Arabic. I'm pursuing Japanese because I lived there for a while and quite fascinated with the culture and the language. When I was a undergraduate student, I took a bilingualism course that discussed the impact of speaking a second language on your cognitive skills. And I thought that was really interesting. And I asked the question of, do we know anything about the impact of bilingualism on the kids with the autism in terms of their cognition? And no, we don't. So I asked this question when I was 20. I'm 28 now, and I'm going to share with you some things that you need to know about bilingualism, autism, and then the interface between both of these in terms of cognition. So I'm just going to walk you through things about cognition, specifically something called executive function. Some of you might be familiar with it. If you're not, that's totally fine, because I'm going to go into it in really boring detail. Bilingualism, autism, and then talk about the interface between both of these in cognitive areas and skills, and what research moving forward that wants to contribute to evidence-based practices with bilingual kids with the autism needs to face in terms of like challenges. I'll tell you a bit more about the research that we're doing at the lab, why this research matters at the end of the day, and some conclusions. So we start with executive function. So this is an interesting story here. In 1848, this young man named Venus Gage, who was 25 at the time, he was a very reliable, capable, hard-working professional. He was a railroad worker. He had an accident at a construction site. He dropped an iron rod that weighed something like 13.5 pounds on a dynamite charge. Obviously, there was a huge explosion, and the resulting explosion resulted in the rod going up the left side of his face, so it went up his left cheek and all the way out the top of his left head. He was rushed to a hospital where he recovered for something like 32 days. What was really cool here is that his intelligence, his working memory, so basic functions like that, stayed pretty intact. They were fine. The issue was his personality. So his behavior was so changed that his friends talked to the physician and they said that he was no longer Gage. This is a very interesting case. This is the first person who suffered extreme, severe brain damage and survived. This is the first case that taught us a lot about the relationship between personality and the frontal part of the brain. Alexander Luria is a Soviet neuropsychologist who actually commented on this case, more specifically talking about the functions of the frontal lobe, and explained that while complex functions like personality, for example, could suffer impairment, basic functions like working memory and intelligence would remain the same. And that patients who suffered like Venus Gage were often quite unaware of the challenges that they are facing. Venus actually couldn't even return back to work. I mean, his behavior was so drastic and changed that his employers couldn't keep him. This particular case led researchers to further develop their understanding of the prefrontal cortex in the 1800s. This is what we know today about some of the things that we know today about the prefrontal cortex. So it's this area of the brain which my partner here, who studied biology, pointed out that this line should be a bit more to the right, because the brain doesn't actually start here. It's more like skull. So this part of the brain is obviously responsible for things like personality, controlling your impulses, planning complex functions, managing or prioritizing the tasks that you are doing that are happening to you at the same time. So if you have to deal with more than one thing at the same time. And there is consensus in the field of neurology that it's not fully developed until you are 25. So what is executive function at the end of all this? The prefrontal cortex that we were talking about is responsible for the processes. The definitions and theory that were derived about this term came from patients who suffered frontal lobe damage. What is missing in the literature, what is really absent, is a truly operational definition of the term. There are over 30 definitions of executive function throughout different literatures. Usually what you come across is this. Plenty of terms subsumed by the definition. So all of these could be used to encompass executive function and refer to them. Now, if you meet somebody who has some difficulties with reading, people who have some kind of like reading impairments, it's really clear what they can't do, right? So, I mean, or what they have challenges doing, like reading. With executive function, it's much more tricky. We can't really tell what an executive function impaired person can't do. We have to adopt a definition moving forward. So I chose to adopt the following. You can definitely choose more from the literature. There are tons. I chose to talk to you about this definition, which is basically including, so basically this process of executive function includes the following skills. So these are some examples like working memory, inhibitory control, and set shifting. Working memory is basically when you need to store some information in your head that you need to retrieve in the short term. Inhibitory control is really interesting. It's split into two things. There's something called interference control. So that means you're focusing on something and ignoring distracting information. It's doing what you need to be doing instead of what you would rather be doing. Like you're listening to this talk, but you would rather, never mind. Um, never mind. There's the second part of inhibitory control, which is response inhibition. That basically has to do with controlling your impulses. So, for example, it's resisting the urge to form any kind of like habitual response, or an urge to, like, if you have this like urge to have a romantic fling while you're married, if you have an urge to cheat, to steal. So we would actually, I mean, if it wasn't for inhibitory control, we would be at the mercy of our impulses. And that's hard to do because we are creatures of habit. Set shifting, also called cognitive flexibility, that is the mental ability to switch your attention from doing one task to the other, or it's also the ability to think about more than one thing at the same time. So switch your thinking from thinking about this talk to something else, about this task to doing something else, or doing more than one thing at the same time. That's what these functions mean, really. And all these functions are responsible for planning, for sequencing, for monitoring your behavior and complex behavior, like the problem solving, for example. So you use all these things to achieve goals like that. This is a real life example that we go through every day of executive function. You're exercising critical executive function skills when you're crossing the road every day, especially if you're talking to someone and you need to watch out to not get killed, and you need to process what the other person is saying and reply back. Coordinating all of these activities exercises executive function skills. Great, now we move on to the bilingualism bit of things. So, bilingualism, never mind, never mind. Bilingualism, obviously, you know, at the talk yesterday that Birandre gave, she mentioned there's an estimated half of the world's population is bilingual, so pretty widespread. When you think about measuring bilingualism, you have to take these factors into consideration: how competent a person is, what's their proficiency level, their exposure, when did you start learning this language? How long have you been speaking this language? Switching is basically, this is an interesting one, I'm just going to go back to this. Switching, I'll just give you an example, because there are single switching contexts, there are dual language switching contexts, there's dense switching the context. Single language context is when I speak to you in one language and I speak to you in my second language. So different people, different contexts, different times, one language here, one language there. A dual language context would incorporate basically I could be talking to you, the same person. I could be talking to you in both of my languages. Same person, same context at the same time. Dense language switching is an interesting one. Could basically be using both my languages in the same sentence. Or I could change a word to make it sound more Arabic. So if I give you an example of a dense switching in context, if I say, please تحط كل حاجة على التable عشان we need to go. So that's kind of like both languages in the same sentence. Or, أنا moody is not that great today. Moody, my mood. I've just taken an English word and made it Arabic. That's pretty dense. The typical kind of like, I think it depends on where you are. So for example, in the UAE, in the Emirates, you would definitely expect a dual language context. So switching back and forth between your languages with the same person in the same context. Why? Because that's just the norm. It's just important to keep in mind that there are some delays when you're thinking about people who are bilingual. We do take longer to retrieve information, and maybe that's because we have two active language systems. So we have two active vocabulary systems there. So we do take some longer time to retrieve. And if you look at each vocabulary that we have, so if you are monolingual and I'm bilingual, you speak English, because you're monolingual, that's like one language that you have, and I'm bilingual. I have English and the Arabic, for example. If you compare my English vocabulary to a monolingual's, it will probably be a bit less. But if you measure my combined vocabulary, English and Arabic, that's the way to move forward, because then you wouldn't be underestimating my language skills. There's a total vocabulary to take into consideration when you're talking about people who are bilingual. Bilingualism, this literature is pretty split, but there are advantages that have been put forward in social cognitive skills, like the perspective taking, which Biranger was talking about yesterday, advantages in executive function skills, which we're going to talk about in a bit. The bilingual advantage is there aren't enough slides in the world to talk about this. There's a pretty big debate at the moment as to whether there is one. So it's definitely quite controversial. Things to take into consideration that many of those studies have actually quite small sample sizes. You could go from something like 20 people in an entire kind of like group, and that they're cross-sectional studies. Matching is pretty interesting. So I think one of the reasons why some studies have found different results is that they've had different matching criteria. Not everybody matched on socioeconomic status, on age, on IQ, and so on. Group differences as a way to analyze might not be the best way moving forward. You need to also think about an individual differences kind of analysis. Look at how people within a group actually perform, rather than always comparing them across to another group. There are studies that have done this, and the results are quite interesting. Yeah, so there are obviously huge variability in samples, like where people actually come from, what kind of context are they switching, is it dense, dual, or single language switching context like I showed you? The tasks and the measures vary widely. We can't even agree on a definition of executive function. So you can imagine if you're trying to measure it, that's a whole other world. All these factors have a lot in common with the autism research literature. Autism. Biranger gave you a pretty good background yesterday, but if you weren't at the talk, this is just something I want to highlight. There's a triad of impairment that is supposed for people with autism spectrum condition. So usually we have some impairment in social interaction, some impairment in communication, and repetitive restricted interests. It's important to understand executive function because they bleed into these characteristics. So if you're not able to shift your attention between one task or the other, you would expect rigid behavior, repetitive, restricted kind of interests. So it's really important to know what executive functions are impacted in children with the autism, for example, because if we target those areas for intervention, they could definitely improve some of the characteristics that we see here. The interface, this is the fun part. So there are researchers, obviously, that focus on bilingualism, researchers that focus on autism. Myself, Biranger, and many other people at the DART team and also around the world focus on the interface between all three. Just to put it for you in a snapshot, this definitely looks quite simple. Basically, the areas that are thought to be disadvantaged in autism are thought to be advantaged in through bilingualism. Just give you a second to think about that. But why would we even expect, why would speaking a second language even improve your cognitive skills in the first place? So just thinking about the theory, why would we even expect an advantage? There's a theory, a widespread kind of theory that is really mentioned a lot in the literature, is that the people who speak two languages have two active language systems in their head. They constantly have to focus on one language, stop the other, and switch back and forth between both the languages. This kind of practice of sustaining your attention in one thing, stopping any distracting kind of competing language or information, and switching back and forth between these two things, that creates a practice where you exercise critical cognitive skills, and that is what makes the executive function system more robust. So that's how speaking a second language is thought, because this is theory at the end of the day, to impact your cognitive skills. So now, considering the significant overlap between bilingualism and autism in the areas that we mentioned, and considering the theory that we just talked about, why bilingualism could impact cognition, it just seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? It's really simple. There are areas that are thought to be advantaged here, same areas that are thought to be disadvantaged. There's a theory that says why we should expect an advantage. So it's pretty straightforward. No, it is anything but that. There are many challenges that research attempting to investigate this the interface faces, and definitely new research needs to keep that in mind. The biggest one are beliefs. So we talked a little bit about this yesterday. There's a widespread belief around the world, spoken with people like from all over the world who share this, that people with autism would be overtaxed by learning the second language, so they're quite often excluded from learning a second language. Speech therapists frequently give the same kind of advice to parents and to families, advising them against teaching them the second language. So it's definitely a barrier to research, right? Because you're dealing with people who are biased to a certain extent, and that can definitely place a barrier in terms of research cooperation moving forward. Definition. So by a show of hand, how many of you would consider this bilingualism? So if you can order a meal in a second language and you can ask for directions, would you consider this bilingual? Yes, you can raise your hand. No, you can keep it down. 2, 3. You can only order a meal. I mean, obviously, like more than one kind, like chicken, fish, and like you have more words to order, more things on the menu. So you can order a meal and you can ask for directions. Are you bilingual? 4. Okay, great. Okay, so the interesting thing is, so there's definitely not a right or wrong answer. The literature is split like this. There are some people who think that's bilingual. There's some people who don't think that is being bilingual. Some people think if you know 10 words, you're bilingual. Some people think if you can do politics and literature, but let's say you can't do like a third subject, then you're not bilingual. And that is the reason why we have different studies that have shown different results. The definition of bilingualism is quite open, and each study will adopt its own definition at the end of the day. Another thing is that the definition of executive function itself, that's also not something that's really clear. You've seen the number of terms that are subsumed by the definition. So defining a construct is something that is a bit of a challenge. Recruitment. Bilingual children with autism are hard to reach, as it is. Now add everything that we need to put as matching criteria: socioeconomic status, age, IQ, so on, because obviously for research we have to match subjects on several things. So you can imagine if we use all these matching the criteria, the numbers start to look something like this. It's one person every now and then. Measurement. So most of the literature on executive function, like bilingualism and its impact on cognition, that is based on typically developing samples. Those kind of measures are not necessarily appropriate for clinical populations, because we need measures with established clinical sensitivity that we can apply to our own population, like children with autism. So we need to come up with new measures, or we need to invest in the measures that we can actually use. Funding. So obviously to answer the question of the impact of bilingualism on the phenomena, like cognition, we would need longitudinal studies with large sample sizes, in different contexts, with different populations around the world. That costs a lot of money. So, by a show of hands, how many of you think that we have 5 to 10 studies on this topic? 1, 2, 3, 4, not sure. 4, 5, okay. How many of you think we have 10 to 30? Okay, like 5, 6. How many of you think we have 40 plus? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Yeah. So I want to talk to you a little bit about our research. This is my research team at the DART group. One of them is also Beranger's supervisor. So Sue Fletcher-Watson brings in her autism expertise, and Sarah McPherson brings in her executive function expertise. So our team is going to the Emirates. Well, I'm going back home, starting January. Does anyone know where this is? Have you been? You've been, well, You live there. Yes, Atlantis, exactly. Unfortunately, our research is not taking place there due to funding, of course. But basically, yes, so this is a bird eye view of the Palm Jumeirah, and that's the Atlantis Hotel. And basically, that's where our research is going to be taking place for the next few months. So starting January, I'll be flying back to work with centers and schools and collect this data. So just to tell you a bit about what could be different about this study, or how does it address some of the challenges that we talked about in terms of the solutions. How am I doing on time? Okay. So I want to ask if bilingual children with the autism will perform any differently than monolingual children with the autism on a certain number of cognitive skills that I've chosen: working memory, inhibitory control, and set shifting, for example, like I've shown you. I also want to see if, I also want to give them both direct measures, like an actual text that you sit down, it's highly structured, and they actually perform the tasks themselves. There are also other kinds of measures like parent ratings, teacher ratings, that are really important to take into consideration, because they kind of not only give us that dual perspective, but they show you their answers will speak to how that child performs over a longer time frame. So I'm testing your performance at one point in time, and that's it. You either do well or you don't. Whereas parents and teachers can kind of tell me, how's this child in general in these same skills? So I think it's very important that we incorporate both measures, direct measures and ratings measures, to answer our questions. We're also going to be comparing them to typically developing kids. We are going to ask the same question of how bilingualism impacts cognition in typically developing kids and kids with the autism. In terms of the design, the UAE is an ideal geographical location to do this kind of work because bilingualism is the norm, and multi-dialecticism is also the norm. So people there speak a minimum of 2 languages. In terms of the participants, so we have a wide range of nationalities, personalities, and age the kind of groups, which we'll definitely be matching on. As far as the recruitment is concerned, obviously that's one of the challenges that we talked about. Inclusion rates for children with autism in the UAE are actually quite high. So some of the centers there, they have more than 50% of their students now in mainstream schools. Because actually shortly after the brother's journey, federal laws changed. So when there were no cases to begin with of children that were going to mainstream schools, when that story kind of was a success, doors kind of opened for more children to follow that path and create their own stories. My mother founded a center herself, Emirates Autism Center, and more than half of those students are now in schools. It was very important to her to try create that opportunity for the other people as well. So as far as recruitment is concerned, we do have a large pool to work with. I'll be traveling to more than one state. So the UAE has 7 states. We'll be traveling to something like 2 or 3 to maximize a representative sample size. As far as materials are concerned, this was a challenge, wasn't it, when I was talking about measurement? So we're just focusing on measures that are computerized, that are time-friendly and short. Computerized because children with the autism, they would really be advantaged by this because it would form some kind of reduced social task demands for them. Also because it's quite visual. So why does anything I just said matter? The significance of this research. There are huge consequences. So I'm not talking about my research. I'm talking about anyone who asks a question in this area of research, because I'm not going to be able to answer this question from one study. We need several studies in all over, in different parts of the world that are most importantly longitudinal with large sample sizes. There are huge consequences for research. I mean, if we don't find out the answer, we can't contribute to any evidence-based practices, and speech therapists and other therapists will continue recommending one language. By the way, there's no evidence to show that an autistic child will be, the studies in the literature that have looked at the impact of bilingualism on people with the autism don't show any kind of disadvantage in a verbal domain, meaning they can function successfully as bilinguals. So it's definitely not evidence-based, which is what we need to change. And as you saw, there's one study to date. It was actually just published last month, so it's that recent. Consequences for therapy, of course, because if we can determine the impact, then we can move forward and look at the best way to teach someone, which was the question yesterday, I believe, sir. But your brother, you had mentioned that example, saying what is the best way to teach someone a second language. we're going to need to find out some things before that, before we can actually try to work that out. Consequences for education and employment. In the UAE, I believe more than 50%, maybe 60% of jobs require you to be bilingual. And with international mobility and migration, your chances are much higher if you actually speak a second language. Identity is probably quite personal. It hits home for myself. My brother's not bilingual himself. My parents chose the native language, which is Arabic for him. But for the other children around the world who need to speak English for school, for kind of like external context and environments, but they need their first language, their mother tongue at home to connect with their communities and families, that's what is at stake. Someone's identity is on the line. And that's why, for all these 4 reasons, we should be looking into this kind of research. Some conclusions I'd like to draw from this. The state of the literature is exactly what you saw. We have 1 study to date. Any research that faces this kind of interface between bilingualism, autism, and cognition will have significant impact on things like your identity, your therapy, your employment prospects, and so on. The biggest challenge, I think, is this: people's beliefs. And this is something that was said to my brother, it was said to my mother, it was said to hundreds of children when they first started things. When they first started their journey. It's something that people with the autism face every day. So imagine if they're trying to learn a second language or if they're trying to achieve really anything. And let me tell you, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Henry Ford said that. I can't take credit for it. That's what I think in terms of the beliefs and how that will be the first step to kind of like go into the community and try to cooperate to do some research. And to conclude, I want to say a big thank you to the DART team at the University of Edinburgh. These are our Twitter profiles, mine and both my supervisors, Sue Fletcher-Watson and Sarah McPherson. You can also catch like some more work that has to do with bilingualism and autism. So for example, with Biranjeh, social, the cognition, some of my other team members are looking at technology and how that impacts people with the autism. I'm looking at executive function. I also want to thank Alex and Richard for putting together this Polyglot conference in the first place. I was just telling them yesterday that the vibe, the tone of a non-academic conference versus an academic conference is just insane. Clearly we prefer this because it's just, I think you just go in like a lot less judgmental, open, receptive to new information. So thank you for putting that together. Academic conferences are also great. Ish. That's fine. And I also want to thank you, all of you wonderful people who basically have come from all over the world with your multilingual brains open to new information and for listening to this talk. Don't hesitate to ask any questions. I think I'm not going to be seeing every single one of you today. I mean, I really hope to. Please come and find me. But in the interest of making a memory, I think this will break Twitter. Here we go. All right, everyone ready? Say polyglot. Thank you. Any questions?
What things do you think we can do in the polyglot community to aid your research?
I think at some point community outreach is the critical part of our research. So when we start circulating information about the actual kind of study, so that it can go forward to the more people. I think also if people have families, if you know someone who's matching, you could also be a very interesting recruitment prospect and increase our chances. So you could have 2 roles, I think, just to begin with, as far as the outreach bit, to try and get people to, for example, to participate just by simply the circulating, and also using your personal contacts and the referrals to direct them to the team so that they could hopefully participate in some research. I think to begin with, those will be a couple of cool things, but I'm sure more things will come to mind, and I'm sure the Biranjeh as well will have more things to contribute to that. And we're on Twitter, so we will be in touch. We'll do that. Thanks, Ophelia.
This is more of a comment, not a question. Hi. But I actually worked until very recently with people who were deafblind,
Yeah.
And a lot of the research when I did my master's had to do with autism, because there's a lot of similarities in how people develop or don't develop communication.
Yeah.
And working in Toronto, like a lot of deaf people are bilingual because they have to learn sign language and English. And in Toronto, being very diverse, a lot of times the parents have a different home language. And the amount of times that people thought they don't have language, they can't communicate, or they would tell me, hey, you know, we have a new person in the program, but they can't really, you know, communicate. So just do your best, and then finding out that no, they can actually communicate, they just do so very differently. And if I try to have a very complex conversation, I might not be able to, but they're able to show a wide range of emotions, be able to communicate what they want, what they like or don't like. Maybe sometimes mixing languages. It was really fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's
anyways,
our
I'm just
job.
really glad that you brought this to the Polyglot conference.
Thank you so much. I think it's our job also as researchers to be creative about how we measure communication and our definition of communication, to try and go on about it in a very inclusive way. Because, like, you know, I mean, just because you can hear me and you can't hear someone else just because, you know, they can't actually vocalize what they're saying, they're definitely communicating. But in a research kind of like context, it's definitely our role to try and take in as many different definitions of the term as possible, and to come up with measures that will creatively assess that wide range of communication. So thanks for sharing that. Great. Hi.
Hi, I'm a speech and language pathologist. I was trained in the United States, and at the time, I was the only speech and language pathologist who spoke languages beyond English. And so my question to you is, how do we change what universities do or require in terms of getting someone trained as speech pathology, a speech pathologist, in order to change what you've spoken about? And my second question is, I'm also an educator of languages at a high school in the United States. Routinely, students who are in the autism spectrum are deprived of language learning, second language learning. I mean, I struggle to convince guidance counselors or school counselors to allow students to participate in a second language study, but they are routinely just taken out or kept away from learning a second language. How do we change that?
That is a phenomenal question. I think especially the first part of the question about policies and the practices within the educational system, I think number one, that is exactly why we need to show the impact through research. Because if you can kind of like pitch what's at stake, and you can show the impact of at least show that it doesn't disadvantage children on the autism spectrum. So the few studies that are out there at the moment, like literally just, I can just count them on my hands, the ones that have talked about the impact of bilingualism on the language skills of children with the autism, haven't found any kind of like a disadvantage. Of course, we need more that are longitudinal with larger sample sizes. On this topic of cognition, so this is the nonverbal part that I'm looking at now, one study that came out last month. So we certainly need to invest more in research. I think that's something that could be taken into consideration if we have more collaborations that can result in world-leading research that has impact, and present that to obviously that this would really help shape evidence-based the practices, clinical policies, educational the policies, and move things forward. I think it's really important for academics and non-academics to work together big time, because obviously at the end of the day, they're the ones you mentioned, so you have that dual kind of capacity, but for those that don't, for example, just the therapists, for example, we definitely need to work together, because evidence-based the practices is not just research. It's research and the clinical settings. Your best the practices in the clinical setting, and our research, the practices put together are creating evidence-based best practices. I think there just needs to be light kind of like shed on these kind of collaborations, because to see the impact in laws, that's only going to come from like success stories and more research. In the case of my brother, that was like years of my mom and my dad, like working with him the one-on-one until she got that meeting. And that meeting was pitching the idea, can I see this child in school? I promise you that he can take all the subjects, his behavior is like transformed. I've been working with him, I did ABA, blah, 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 so on, so on. So she showed them footage and they agreed to take him on. And only when he could actually like go in and succeed and finish high school and get a job, the doors opened for thousands of children with the autism to follow in the exact same step. So, you know, the country has one of the highest inclusion rates in the Middle East. So, do you know what I mean? Like, you have to put in the work to make an impact and then raise that on a higher level. You have to show what's at stake. So I try to do that with funding the proposals, to try and pitch in the value to governments, to schools, to centers, try to do research kind of like with them. So I hope that answers your question like a little bit. And let's, you know, connect further to talk about it. Cheers.
Hi. Sorry. My name is Evelina. I'm Polish. I live on Iceland. I'm a school teacher in primary school. And I don't have much, how say, oh, my English is so poor. Sorry
No,
about
you're
that.
fine. Go.
But anyhow, I met few kids with autism spectrum, and some of them were Polish. That's why I work, because usually I work at school to help Polish kids to get an Icelandic. And what happened with the kids with autism, it was they didn't communicate at all. They didn't communicate in Polish and not in Icelandic. Sometimes they use English or use their iPads also in English to communicate. So I came here to have an answer and recipe. So what are the best practices for those children? And I didn't get this answer here and recipe, and that's why I'm still waiting. What would you suggest for those parents and teachers? Yes, and could you?
I think something important to mention, and I think also my colleague Dabiranja mentioned this yesterday. The whole point of doing this kind of research is to find out what aspects of bilingualism work for what children, at what point in time, and where. So we need to fill in a lot of gaps there. So we shouldn't, one of the scenarios that we can expect here is that bilingual children will be better. One of the other scenarios is that they perform exactly the same, which is, by the way, a huge win for the autism community because it shows that there's no disadvantage, that they're both able to function successfully as bilinguals. A third possibility, which is much less likely but definitely possible, is that it would disadvantage them in some ways. So it's important to know that there are huge individual differences between people with like autism. It can have one effect on someone, something else for someone else, and something third for someone completely different. We can't anticipate the actual the performance. I know that at the time that my brother was starting out, second language wasn't much of an option. But now it definitely is with like the growth that he showed. If someone is like non-verbal, for example, and I think there was a very lovely quote that Biranja shared yesterday from one of the parents who was asked, why wouldn't you teach your child a second language or something to that extent? And she said, I don't care. I just want her to be able to speak. You know, so like obviously parents have different priorities. I think the best way to answer this kind of like question, evidence-based, the practices for bilingual kids with the autism, about teaching them and so on, it depends on a number of things. The child's cognitive skills, the parents' preferences, the child's interest and preferences, and how supportive the environment that they're in is. Because if you're trying to teach someone a second language in an environment where it's not conducive, they can't practice it, or they don't have enough resources and skills to be supported by peers or by teachers, especially if you're already having impairments and other kind of like areas, then that's not going to work out very well. So those are three things to take into consideration. We need to do a lot of research with parents anyway to find out what are their preferences, their interests. When you say that the children spoke sometimes in Polish, sometimes in English, there's a whole support system that needs to be taken into consideration. And I think we should first remember what are the child's cognitive skills to begin with, what are his interests in terms of language, what are the parents' preferences, and how supportive is the environment that is actually around them to actually go ahead and teach them in a second language. Won't be able to share with you any kind of like resources about how to go and teach someone like a second language if they're impaired. And I think the gentleman here asked that question yesterday to the Biranger, how do we teach someone like who's, let's say, impaired or who's the autistic, so on, because it's just so out of my field. But those are things that come to mind that you should think about, definitely. And let's also connect, because I'm sure we have some people on Twitter that are more able to talk about the teaching bit of languages. Definitely bilingual speech language the pathologists that work with families and know their needs. So they can give you a bit more advice than I can. Any more questions?
Yes, thank you.
Where? Oh, yes. Oh, hi.
Thank you for a wonderful talk on autism, for sharing your family's experience, which is rather amazing. You have very proactive parents that sound like they're able to push stuff through, so that's great.
Thanks.
And I wanted to ask a question about your study that you're planning in the UAE there. I'm not familiar at all with the UAE context, but thinking from the American context of children that are actually in specialty programs or at least receiving case management services for autism, I would imagine in the U.S. at least that there would be a floor of their socioeconomic status, that below a certain socioeconomic status they wouldn't even be present in such facilities. And so when controlling for SES, you would not really be getting the lower levels.
True.
And I'm not sure if that would be true.
I think
children of immigrants or...
Yeah, oh no, the UAE is a country of immigrants. 2% of the population is local. The 98% of the population is basically expats. So when we ask about socioeconomic status, we will measure it in the following. So we're basically just getting an idea of the parental education level, so both the mother and the father. That's it. We're not getting a measure of income or any of those things because I'm not really sure that matters. It's just more about the parents' level of education, because there are studies in the literature that's shown that has an impact on a child's, obviously, cognitive skills and so on. By applying any kind of matching criteria, guys, whether it's IQ, age, limiting it to, let's say, kids who are just 5 to 12, I'm definitely losing a huge pool. But that's how you do, like, well-designed research. The kids have to be matched in on certain the criteria, and we focused on criteria that have come out the most in the literature as the ones that are really having an impact on the performance. So, yes, we are losing people. But yes, that also helps the research be more focused, be more well-designed, and definitely better. Other studies can do research with like low SES, high SES, medium. So that's really for the researcher to decide. Yeah.
Good. We have time for one last question here.
Hi. I'm also from Poland, and I live in Iceland. I have a son with high functioning autism, and he's exposed to 3 languages at this time. And I also happen to work with children on autism spectrum, and it's going to be more about it's probably more like a comment, not about the question, but you know that on autism spectrum there is no 2 exactly the same kind of child. So you know how to say, if you know one person with autism, then you know just one person with autism. Yeah. So how are you planning to base this research on? What works exactly for this child may not work for all of the others. So
yeah,
that's
excellent.
Tricky.
Yeah. Biranger also said yesterday that it is, when you're dealing with an autism population, it's extremely hard to generalize the results, but from our side, because that was definitely a challenge that was mentioned in the slide. So from our side, we will attack this through analysis. So the way you analyze the data. So we're not just going to be looking at group differences, we're going to be looking at individual differences. So it's like a single case kind of study analysis. So looking at each individual and analyzing their performance, which is definitely wonderful, because that's going to bring out the individual differences that you're talking about. And that will give us an idea of the performance of each child, and not just compare them to like a whole the other group. So that's how we're going on about it. You just have to be more, we just have to come up with creative ways to really look at the individual, at the at the end of the day, even if you do individual differences analysis, we need more research with like wider age groups, all over the world, large sample sizes, longitudinal. That's the best way. That's how you can come up. And that's also something else that I think the community can help with, funding opportunities. I think that's the number one, because that's what stops research from actually going out to the world. So that's a very important point that the community can also help with.
Thank you, Shereen. I'm
Thank
sure
you, guys.
everybody in this
Thanks
room
very
agrees
much.
that this was a very interesting and informative